Elliot was born into a world that many people thought he wouldn't be able to fully experience. He was blind from birth, which meant he could never see the faces of his family, never see the beauty of nature, and never witness the colorful world around him. From a young age, Elliot's parents were faced with the challenge of raising a child who couldn't rely on the sense of sight to explore the world like other children did. But that didn't stop Elliot. Even though he couldn't see the faces of his parents, he could feel their love. He couldn't see the bright sky, but he could feel the warmth of the sun on his face. Music was one of the few things that seemed to speak to him in a way that words could not. Every time a song played on the radio or his parents hummed a tune, he would smile, a sense of calm washing over him. He loved the way the music made him feel. It was as though the sound could paint pictures in his mind, telling stories without ever needing to show him an image. But like many children born with a disability, Elliot faced challenges beyond just learning how to live without sight. There were moments when people treated him like he was different, as if his blindness meant he wasn't capable of doing things that others could do easily. His parents, who tried their best to support him, couldn't help but wonder what kind of future their son would have. They worried about how Elliot would find his place in the world, where opportunities were often closed to people with disabilities. One afternoon, when Elliot was around 7 years old, his parents took him to a local music school. They had heard about a renowned pianist in the area, a man who had been praised for his skill and talent on the piano. Maybe, just maybe, he could teach Elliot something that would help him unlock his potential. Elliot's parents hoped this experience might help their son discover a way to channel his love for music into something real. When they arrived at the music school, Elliot's excitement was contagious. He could feel the buzz in the air, the way the floor felt under his feet, the echo of voices and instruments around him. But it wasn't long before things started to feel different. As they walked through the hallways, Elliot's parents began to sense an underlying tension. There were whispers here and there, disbelief, doubt, and even the occasional chuckle. Elliot was blind, after all. People didn't expect much from someone like him, not when it came to music, a field that required such a strong sense of hearing and touch. When they finally met the pianist, a man with sharp eyes and a serious expression, Elliot felt a nervous shiver run down his spine. He could tell that this was someone important, someone who was used to being in control. His parents hoped that this pianist would be different, kind, understanding, but they quickly realized that this would not be the case. The man didn't greet them with the warmth they had expected. Instead, he looked at Elliot as if sizing him up before speaking in a matter-of-fact tone. "I don't mean to sound harsh," he said, "but you'll never play the piano like others. You're blind, and that's not something that can be easily overcome. Music is a visual art, after all. You can't learn what you can't see." Elliot's heart sank. His parents looked at each other, unsure of what to say. They had brought him here in hopes of giving him an opportunity to grow, but instead they were met with doubt and skepticism. Elliot, however, didn't speak. He didn't argue. He simply stood there, feeling the weight of the words hang in the air. It wasn't the first time he had been told what he couldn't do, but somehow hearing it from someone so respected, someone who seemed to know so much about music, made it hurt more. His dream of learning the piano seemed impossible in that moment. Despite the harsh words, Elliot didn't give up on his love for music. He continued to hum songs to himself at night, tapping rhythms with his fingers on whatever surfaces he could find. He would listen to the songs his parents played on the radio and imagine himself playing them. He had a natural sense for melody and rhythm, and he began to develop an understanding of how music was made, not just by sight, but through feeling, hearing, and understanding the patterns in sound. His parents, though shaken by the pianist's harsh assessment, refused to let him give up on his dreams. They didn't have the answers, but they did have love and support. They encouraged him to keep trying, even when others might doubt him. Slowly, over the next few years, Elliot began to experiment on his own. With no formal training, he relied on his hearing. He would sit at an old piano they had found in the attic, feeling the keys under his fingers, listening intently as he tried to recreate the songs he had heard. It was slow at first, he made many mistakes, and the sound wasn't always right. But with each mistake came a new understanding of how music worked. Each time he played, he felt closer to his goal. At first it was just small tunes, things he could remember from the radio or from songs his parents had sung. But as time passed, Elliot became more confident. He began to experiment with his own compositions, using the piano as an instrument to express emotions he couldn't always put into words. Each note was a building block. The more he practiced, the more he learned, and the more his love for music deepened. But there were times when Elliot still faced doubt, not just from others, but from within himself. There were days when he questioned if it was even possible for someone like him, someone who couldn't see, to ever truly succeed in a world where music was often associated with visual beauty and complexity. There were nights when he wondered if he would ever be able to prove the harsh words of the pianist wrong. The journey was tough, filled with moments of frustration, loneliness, and uncertainty. But through it all, Elliot never stopped playing. He played in the quiet of his room in the middle of the night, when no one was listening and when no one could tell him he couldn't do it. It wasn't about showing the world or proving anyone wrong. It was about the music itself, about finding a way to connect with something bigger than himself, something that transcended the limitations others had placed on him. And in those moments when he lost himself in the sound, Elliot felt something that was stronger than any doubt, any criticism, any label. He felt like he was truly alive. Music was his language. Music was his sight. Music was his way of understanding the world. Even though no one else believed in him at that point, Elliot didn't need anyone to tell him what he could or couldn't do. He had already begun to believe in himself, and that belief, though small at first, would one day grow into something powerful enough to change the world. Elliot's journey to learn the piano didn't happen overnight. It was a long, often frustrating road, filled with moments when he felt like giving up. But there was something deep inside him, a drive, a passion that kept him going. Every time he sat at the piano, no matter how difficult it seemed, he found himself immersed in the music. It became his escape, his way of understanding the world, and in many ways it became his only real way of communicating his emotions. When Elliot first started teaching himself, it was slow. His fingers didn't move like the fingers of a trained pianist, and his sense of touch wasn't enough to guide him through every complex melody. At first, he could only play simple tunes, the ones he remembered from the radio or songs his parents had sung to him when he was younger. They weren't perfect. There were plenty of wrong notes, and the music sounded clumsy at times. But Elliot didn't care. It wasn't about being perfect. It was about learning. He spent hours at the old piano in the attic, which had been collecting dust for years. The keys were worn and some of the notes didn't sound quite right, but it didn't matter. Elliot didn't need the piano to be pristine. He just needed to hear the sounds. Every day he would play, trying to figure out how to make the music come to life. It was hard work, and often it felt like he wasn't getting anywhere. But he kept at it, determined to improve, even though he had no formal training and no one to guide him. His parents, though supportive, didn't have the answers he needed. They couldn't tell him how to overcome the challenges he faced, not because they didn't want to, but because they just didn't know how. They had never dealt with the difficulties Elliot faced. But they were always there cheering him on. They listened as he played, offering words of encouragement, and when he made mistakes, they reminded him that mistakes were just a part of learning. But it wasn't always easy. There were many nights when Elliot felt frustrated. There were times when his fingers seemed to move all over the place, hitting wrong notes again and again. He would take a break, his mind spinning with doubts. Maybe this was a mistake, he thought. Maybe I'm not good enough to play. Maybe I'll never be able to do this. Yet despite the self-doubt that crept in during those tough moments, there was always something else, something stronger, that kept him going. It wasn't just the music he loved. It was the feeling he got when the notes clicked together. When the melody started to make sense, it was like a light turned on inside him, and all the struggles suddenly felt worth it. Even the most difficult days couldn't take that feeling away. It was the feeling of connection, of expression, of something bigger than himself. That feeling was his reason to keep trying, even when the world seemed to tell him he couldn't do it. Over time, Elliot's skills began to improve. Slowly but surely, the clumsy tunes he once played began to sound more polished, more fluid. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. His fingers learned to move more confidently over the keys, finding the right notes with greater ease. He wasn't just playing the piano anymore. He was learning how to feel the music. He could sense the way the melody swelled and dipped, the way the rhythm carried the song forward. His touch became more intuitive, and he started to develop a deeper understanding of the piano as an instrument. But it wasn't just the physical skills he was working on. Elliot was also learning how to listen. Really listen. He had always relied on his sense of hearing to understand the world, but now, as he dove deeper into music, he began to listen in a new way. He listened for the nuances in every note, every chord. He listened for the way each sound blended into the next, the way a song could tell a story without ever needing to say a word. Music was more than just sound, it was a language he was learning to speak. There were still plenty of challenges. Elliot was not attending a music school, and there was no one there to tell him what he was doing right or wrong. He had no formal lessons to follow, but he had a passion that was stronger than any textbook or set of instructions. He spent hours each day playing, figuring things out by ear. He listened to the same songs over and over, trying to pick up on the smallest details. He would sit by the radio, close his eyes and focus on every note, every change in the melody, every beat of the drum. Then, he would try to play what he heard, feeling the music flow through his fingertips. But it wasn't just about memorizing songs. Elliot began to experiment, adding his own twist to the music he heard. He would take a song and change the tempo or add new chords or combine different melodies together. It wasn't always successful, but when it worked, it was like magic. His music started to take on a life of its own, a unique sound that reflected his own soul. As Elliot's playing improved, something else started to happen. He began to share his music with people outside his family. He would play for friends, and though they were always supportive, they weren't always sure what to make of it. The music sounded different from what they were used to hearing. It was raw and emotional, filled with unexpected twists and turns, but they could feel the passion behind it. They could feel that Elliot was playing from his heart, not just from his fingers. At first, Elliot didn't mind the mixed reactions. He wasn't playing for approval. He was playing because it was what he loved. It was his way of connecting with the world, and that was enough for him. But as time went on, he began to wonder, could anyone ever truly understand the music I'm making? Am I just a kid playing on an old piano? Or is there something more to this? One evening, after practicing for hours, Elliot's parents sat down beside him. They could see how much he had grown, not just in skill but in confidence. His playing had become something special, something that had the potential to change not just his life, but maybe the lives of others. "You're getting really good, Elliot," his mother said softly. "You've come a long way since we first started. Maybe you should think about taking this more seriously. Maybe you should start looking for someone who can help you grow, someone who can teach you more." Elliot paused, thinking. He had always dreamed of getting formal lessons, of learning from someone who really understood music. But there was also a part of him that felt unsure. He had taught himself up until this point, and that had worked for him. What if a teacher didn't understand the way he learned or the way he felt the music? What if he was better off staying on his own path? But deep down, Elliot knew that he couldn't do it all by himself forever. He had reached a point where he needed more. He needed to know if what he was doing was even possible. Could he really make it in the world of music, or was this just a hobby for a boy who would never truly fit in? One day, Elliot finally made the decision. He would reach out for help. It wasn't going to be easy, and there would be plenty of people who doubted him just as they always had. But he was ready to take the next step no matter what anyone else thought. He knew that the road ahead wouldn't be simple. But with every note he played, with every melody he created, he felt closer to something bigger, and that was all that mattered. As time passed, Elliot's determination to master the piano only grew stronger. He had spent years playing on his own, developing his ear and learning the nuances of the instrument. But deep down he knew that to truly reach his full potential, he needed something more. He needed guidance. He needed someone who could show him how to take his skills to the next level, someone who could help him refine his technique and push him beyond his limits. The idea of seeking formal training wasn't an easy decision for Elliot. He had spent so much time teaching himself, figuring things out on his own. What if a teacher didn't understand his way of learning? What if they told him it wasn't possible for someone like him, someone who couldn't see to make it in the world of music? But as much as he had learned, he felt like there was still a gap, a space he couldn't quite fill on his own. His parents, seeing the fire in his eyes, encouraged him to take that next step. They knew that Elliot had something special, something that couldn't be ignored, but finding the right person to help him was going to be tricky. After all, this wasn't just about learning how to play the piano. It was about finding someone who could see his potential beyond his blindness. It wasn't about focusing on what he couldn't do, but on what he could do and where his talents could take him. One day, after weeks of talking it over, Elliot's parents found a music professor who was known for working with unique talents, people who didn't fit the traditional mold of a musician. The professor was open-minded, patient, and willing to take on students with different needs and learning styles. Elliot wasn't sure what to expect, but at that point he was willing to try anything. When the day of the audition finally arrived, Elliot felt a mix of excitement and nerves. This was his big chance. He was about to play in front of someone who had the power to change everything for him. He had heard so much about the professor, and he hoped that this person would see something in him, something that others might have missed. Elliot sat nervously in the waiting room, his hands trembling slightly. He could feel the buzz of energy in the air as other students practiced nearby, but he tried to block it out. This was his moment, and he needed to focus. Finally, his name was called. He stood up, took a deep breath, and walked into the room. The professor, a kind woman with a calm demeanor, smiled warmly at him. "Hello, Elliot," she said. "I've heard a lot about you." The professor gestured to the grand piano in the corner of the room. "Why don't you start by playing something you've been working on?" she asked. Elliot nodded, his heart pounding. He walked over to the piano and placed his fingers on the keys. He had been practicing a beautiful, complicated piece, a piece that combined classical elements with more modern sounds, something he had composed on his own. He had put his heart into this song, and now he was going to play it for someone who could truly understand it. As his fingers touched the keys, the music flowed out. At first there was a sense of hesitation, like he was testing the waters, but as he settled into the rhythm, his confidence grew. The melody swirled around the room, moving up and down, weaving through the different chords, telling a story all its own. Elliot could feel the music come alive beneath his fingertips. It wasn't perfect, but it was raw and real. It was him. The professor sat quietly, listening intently. When Elliot finished, there was a long pause. Elliot couldn't help but hold his breath. He had been nervous about what she would think, but now that it was done, he wanted to know. Was it enough? Would she understand what he was trying to express? Finally, the professor spoke. "That was beautiful, Elliot," she said, her voice calm but full of warmth. "You've got something truly unique here, something that I haven't heard from anyone else." Elliot's heart lifted. For the first time in a long while, someone was not only acknowledging his talent but praising it. It was more than just encouragement, it was validation. "I think we can work together," the professor continued. "I can help you refine your skills and teach you new techniques, but what you have, that passion, that sound, that way of seeing music, I wouldn't change a thing. We'll build on that." It felt like a weight had been lifted from Elliot's shoulders. After all the years of doubting himself, of trying to prove people wrong, he had finally found someone who saw him for who he really was, a musician, someone who had something special to offer the world. For the next few months, Elliot worked closely with the professor. Every lesson brought something new, new techniques to learn, new ways to approach the piano, new ideas to explore. But the biggest change came in the way Elliot started to view himself. He wasn't just a blind boy who played the piano. He was a musician with a voice, with something important to say through his music. The professor didn't just teach him the rules of music. She helped him find his own voice within it, and that made all the difference. Still, not everything was easy. Even with all the support from the professor, Elliot faced his own doubts. There were days when he felt like he would never be able to play as well as other students. Days when his fingers couldn't quite match the speed of the music in his head. And then there were the moments when he would remember the harsh words of the pianist he had met years ago, the one who had told him he'd never play like others. Sometimes those words echoed in his mind, trying to convince him that maybe, just maybe, he didn't belong in this world of music. But each time, Elliot pushed back. He knew that what he had was different. His music wasn't about perfection, it was about feeling. It was about connecting with the listener on a deeper level, in a way that couldn't be explained by mere technique. And in those moments of doubt, he reminded himself that he wasn't playing for anyone else. He was playing for himself, for the music, and for the dream that had kept him going all these years. As Elliot's skills grew, so did his confidence. He began to take on bigger challenges, more difficult pieces, more complex compositions. He started performing in front of larger audiences, first for small groups, then for more public events. Each time he played, he felt more at home on the stage, more certain that this was what he was meant to do. The more Elliot performed, the more people began to take notice. It wasn't just that he was a blind pianist, it was that his music was different. There was something raw, something genuine about the way he played. It wasn't about perfection, it was about emotion, about telling a story with every note. And yet, as Elliot began to gain recognition, there was still one person who hadn't heard his music yet. The same person who had told him he couldn't play, the one who had dismissed him all those years ago. It was time for that encounter. But Elliot wasn't nervous anymore. He wasn't trying to prove anyone wrong. He was playing for himself, and that was enough. As Elliot's music began to draw attention, his confidence soared. For the first time, he felt like he was on the right path, a path that led him toward a future in music that felt more real than ever before. With each performance, with each new piece he composed, Elliot saw himself not just as a blind boy who played the piano, but as a legitimate musician, someone whose music could touch people, move them, and even change the way they thought about music itself. His journey, though difficult, was starting to pay off. He performed in local venues, at charity events, and even in small concerts. His name began to spread, not just because of his blindness, but because of his raw talent and unique sound. There was something in the way Elliot played that made people stop and listen, really listen. His music wasn't about perfection. It was about emotion. It was about telling a story with every note, with every pause, with every chord. And it was that passion, that soul, that made his music stand out. But even as his success grew, there was one lingering thought that kept appearing in the back of his mind. The pianist who had once told him that he would never play. The man who had dismissed him so easily all those years ago. Elliot had never forgotten the words, "You'll never play like others. You're blind. That's not something you can overcome." It was a moment that had hurt him deeply, a moment that had made him question himself and his abilities. But now, years later, Elliot felt ready to face that moment again. He had something to prove, not to anyone else, but to himself. He knew he wasn't the same boy who had walked into that music school, full of doubts. He had grown, he had learned, and most importantly, he had found his own voice in music. Now it was time to show the world, and the pianist, that he was capable of far more than anyone had ever imagined. One evening, as Elliot was preparing for a performance at a local music festival, he found out that the pianist who had once discouraged him would also be attending the event. The same man who had told him he would never play the piano like others would be sitting in the audience, listening to the very music that Elliot had spent years perfecting. It felt like fate, like the moment had finally arrived for him to prove just how far he had come. At first, Elliot wasn't sure what to feel. Anger, excitement, nerves. Part of him wanted to go up to the man and remind him of the harsh words he had spoken, but another part of him realized that he didn't need to do that. He didn't need to confront him directly. The best way to prove his worth was through the music itself. If the pianist had any doubts left, Elliot knew that his performance would erase them. The night of the performance, the atmosphere was electric. The venue was packed with people from all walks of life, and Elliot could feel the energy in the air. His heart was pounding, but it wasn't from nerves. This time, it was anticipation. He had worked so hard for this moment, and now it was here. As he walked onto the stage, he felt a sense of calm wash over him. He had learned to trust the music. He had learned to trust himself. The audience fell silent as Elliot took his place at the piano. He could sense the weight of the room's attention on him, but he wasn't afraid. He placed his fingers on the keys, feeling the cool touch of the piano beneath his hands. For a moment, everything else faded away. It was just him and the music. Elliot's fingers moved effortlessly across the keys, weaving through the melody with a sense of freedom and grace. The piece he had chosen to play was one of his own compositions, a powerful and moving piece that reflected everything he had experienced on his journey. It was a blend of classical music and modern styles, filled with both light and darkness, joy and sorrow. It was a reflection of him. As the music filled the room, Elliot could feel the audience's response. They were captivated, hanging on every note. He could hear the whispers, the gasps, the soft sighs of appreciation, but he didn't need to hear their praise. He could feel the music itself flowing through him, telling a story that only he could tell. In the middle of the piece, Elliot's mind wandered for just a moment. He could feel the presence of someone in the audience, the pianist sitting there watching him. Was he impressed? Was he finally seeing the truth? Elliot didn't know, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that this moment was his. This was his time to shine. And as he finished the final note of the piece, the audience erupted into applause. The sound of the clapping, the cheers. It was a moment of pure validation. Elliot stood up from the piano, his heart racing, his body shaking with adrenaline. But there was no feeling of triumph over anyone else. It wasn't about proving the pianist wrong anymore. It was about showing the world that he had earned his place, not because of what others thought of him, but because of the music he had created. After the performance, as Elliot walked off the stage, he saw the pianist approaching him. The man's face was unreadable, his expression hard to read. But then, unexpectedly, the pianist extended his hand to Elliot. You've done something incredible," the pianist said, his voice low but genuine. "I didn't think it was possible, but you've proven me wrong. Your music, it's unlike anything I've ever heard. I'm impressed." Elliot was stunned. The words he had never expected to hear were coming from the very person who had told him he couldn't do it. For a moment, he didn't know what to say. The man had doubted him, but now, here he was, acknowledging his talent. And in that moment, Elliot realized something important. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone. He had already done that with his music. With a simple nod, Elliot accepted the handshake. "Thank you," he said quietly, feeling the weight of the moment. "But I wasn't playing to prove you wrong. I was playing for myself." And that was the truth. The validation from the pianist, while meaningful, was just icing on the cake. What really mattered was that Elliot had found his own path. He had overcome the doubt, the challenges, and the pain. He had built his own future, one note at a time. As Elliot walked away from the stage that night, he felt a sense of peace wash over him. He didn't need the world to tell him he was good enough anymore. He already knew. He was exactly where he needed to be. The months that followed Elliot's performance at the music festival were nothing short of transformative. After that night, his name became more well-known in music circles. People were drawn not just to his story, but to the music he played. The unique sound he created, raw, emotional, and full of depth, was unlike anything they had ever heard. He wasn't just a blind pianist anymore. He was a true artist, a musician whose talent spoke for itself. Elliot continued to perform at more events both locally and eventually, internationally. But no matter how many stages he played on, no matter how many awards or accolades came his way, there was always one thing that kept him grounded: his love for the music itself. The applause and the recognition were nice, but they were never the reason he played. His music was his way of speaking, of connecting with the world. It was a language that didn't need words, a language that could speak directly to the soul. As Elliot's career continued to grow, he made sure to stay true to the roots of his journey. He started working with other young musicians, sharing his experiences with them and helping them find their own voices. Elliot knew what it felt like to be underestimated, to be told that your dreams were impossible. And he didn't want anyone to feel that way. If his story could inspire just one person to believe in themselves, then everything he had been through would have been worth it. He began mentoring a few aspiring pianists, some of whom faced challenges similar to his own. There were children who, like him, couldn't see the keys but still felt the music in their bones. Elliot helped them, not just by teaching them how to play, but by showing them that being different didn't mean being limited. Being unique didn't mean being less. It meant having something the world needed to hear. Through his mentorship, Elliot realized that the journey of learning, growing, and overcoming obstacles never really ended. Even though he had come so far, there were always new things to learn, new boundaries to push. The more he shared his knowledge, the more he grew as an artist, as a teacher, and as a person. He was constantly discovering new ways to approach music. new techniques to incorporate into his playing, and new ways to express himself through his compositions. But as much as Elliot enjoyed teaching others, he never lost sight of his own artistry. His music was still his first love, and he was always seeking to push the limits of what he could do. He spent countless hours in his studio, experimenting with sounds, blending genres, and composing pieces that would surprise even himself. Music was the one constant in his life, the one thing he could always count on to help him make sense of the world. One day, Elliot was invited to perform at a prestigious music gala, an event attended by some of the most respected musicians and composers in the world. It was the opportunity of a lifetime. But this time he wasn't nervous. He wasn't worried about what people might think of him. He knew who he was as an artist, and he knew that this performance would be another chance for him to share his voice with the world. As the night of the gala approached, Elliot reflected on how far he had come. He thought about the little boy who had been told he could never play the piano, the boy who had sat in the attic trying to make sense of the music he loved. He thought about all the nights of frustration, the doubts, the moments when he almost gave up. And then he thought about all the times he had pushed through those doubts and kept going. He had faced so much, and now here he was, performing at one of the most prestigious events in the world. When the night finally arrived, the atmosphere was electric. The venue was filled with renowned musicians, critics and patrons, all eager to hear the next rising star in the music world. As Elliot walked on stage, he could feel the weight of their eyes on him, but there was no fear. He had been here before, and this time he was not trying to prove anything. He was simply there to share the music he had created. Music that came from his heart. Music that spoke without words. He sat down at the grand piano, his fingers resting lightly on the keys. The lights dimmed and the room fell into a quiet hush, and then Elliot began to play. His fingers moved across the piano with grace and confidence, playing a composition that he had poured his heart into. The piece was a journey, a reflection of everything he had experienced, from the pain of being told he couldn't succeed to the triumph of proving everyone wrong. It was both haunting and beautiful, filled with moments of tension and release, hope and despair. It was a piece that captured the essence of his story, the music of a boy who had never given up, no matter how many people told him he couldn't. As he played, Elliot felt a sense of connection with the audience. He could feel their emotions shifting with every note, every chord. And when the final note of the piece echoed through the hall, the room remained still for a moment, silent, as if everyone was taking in the weight of what they had just heard. And then, the applause came, louder and more intense than anything Elliot had ever experienced. It wasn't just appreciation for the music. It was recognition of his journey, his perseverance, and the depth of his talent. The standing ovation was overwhelming, and for the first time in his life, Elliot realized that he was no longer just a boy playing the piano. He was an artist, someone whose music had the power to move people in ways he had never imagined. As Elliot left the stage that night, he was filled with a sense of peace, a sense of completion. He had done it. He had proven to the world and to himself that he was more than his circumstances, more than his limitations. He had found a way to turn his challenges into something beautiful, something that could inspire others. Elliot's journey was far from over, but in that moment he knew that the road ahead would always be guided by the music. It was the music that had kept him going, the music that had given him the strength to rise above the doubts and the fears. And as long as he had that music in his heart, he knew he would never stop playing.